Thank you so much. So the title of my presentation is Mapping Transnormativity, Body Mapping as Method. And this is just a little bit of an overview in terms of what I'm going to talk about this morning. So first of all, I'm going to give a brief overview of the project, which is entitled Transnormativity and the Everyday Life Worlds of Young Trans Men in Ireland. And then I'm going to move into talking about body mapping as embodied method. So I'm going to talk about what the method's history is, how I kind of came to it, and why I felt it was meaningful for this particular project. And then I'm going to talk about like how to map bodies, like what were the ethical, logistical, and theoretical conceptualizing that I did in order to make this kind of possible for the project. And then I'm going to finish with some kind of key considerations around what the contributions of the body maps are to the project. There's two of the body maps there on one of the tables, just an example. So I'll leave them out for a bit during the coffee break as well for you to take a look at. My only ask is that you don't take any photos of them if that's okay. So just a bit of an overview of the project. So in existing literature, transnormativity is presented as a hegemonic ideology that structures transgender experience, identification, and narratives into a hierarchy of legitimacy. And this is from Johnson, who is pretty widely cited in the literature on transnormativity. And what Johnson is really saying is that trans people are kind of produced in relation to the norms of medicalization. So whether or not trans people want to engage in the medicalization of transness, whether we want to medically transition or not, we're kind of held in relation to those norms. And this is what produces transnormativity as a hegemonic regulatory ideology. And a lot of the existing literature has kind of concerned itself with what I kind of term transnormative subjecthood. So it's kind of using transnormativity as an analytic concept to say something about the ways in which people uphold transnormativity in different systemic and structural contexts. And this is, you know, often kind of located itself within kind of film and media and kind of cultural analysis. And there's been a real gap in terms of empirical evidence. So there hasn't been a huge amount of research done on what's actually happening in terms of transnormativity in the lived lives of trans people. And a lot of the existing research has emerged from a North American context. So this particular research was really concerned with the impact of transnormativity in the lived experience of trans young men in an Irish context, to kind of bring in that empirical research and also to contribute the kind of specificity of an Irish context. Sorry, there's just a thing on the screen here. I've touched it. I hope it's okay. It's gone. I'm sorry. So the overarching question which drives this research is considering the potential presence and the impact of transnormativity in the life worlds of young trans men in Ireland. And now it will not move. Oh yeah, thank you. So how was I going to do this? Like, transnormativity is a really complex ideology, and how was I going to account for its presence and explore that with young trans men? So part of that was immediately realizing that I was concerned with and I wanted to capture the depth and breadth of young trans men's lived experience, because in part of there's nothing on transnormativity in an Irish context, there's also just very little research about trans people in an Irish context that's actually done by trans people. So I looked to qualitative methods, specifically narrative inquiry, in order to kind of say that I wanted to capture the depth and breadth of their experiences, that every single aspect of that was really valuable, and I wanted to give them the opportunity to tell their story in their own words. And from that then, you know, in international and national literature, trans people obviously experience a lot of inequalities, like socially, politically, economically, and just presenting as trans in public life. So this particular research, though, you know, a lot of the times trans communities, we can be positioned as kind of hegemonically vulnerable or hegemonically marginal. So this particular piece of research, it moves to acknowledge the specific vulnerabilities that these young trans men faced as a result of their transness, but also at the intersections of marginality, and also to recognize that they crafted and negotiated life worlds that are resilient and are also kind of in relation to these forms of inequality. Like, they're really finding ways to push back and craft life worlds outside of that oppression as well. So part of that then led me to think about community-based research. So I started to glean really valuable insights from community-based research, ideas and conceptualizings. And some of that was that, you know, community-based research, it starts with a research project an idea that's of practical relevance to a community and it's carried out in community settings. So Singh et al. Really talk about the importance of conducting, trans studies research within trans communities, building authentic relationships, collaborating with participants, and making really valuable links between research, social change, and advocacy. And from the inception of this project, like the very, very beginning, this was embedded in my employment partner, the trans community setting of Belong To, which is Ireland's national LGBTQ+ youth service. So from the very beginning of the project, I went to the youth groups and I got to know the young trans men that we provide the services to. So I would have given workshops just on boxing. I would have facilitated additional pieces of research, maybe in relation to their experiences of accessing services or violence and discrimination, and just went in and not been this faceless researcher that was going to come in and mine their lived experience for data so that I could get a PhD, but actually I was building this integral and iterative relationship with them so that when I came to them and I was asking them really vulnerable questions about their lived experience so that we could have, a greater understanding of transnormativity, they felt like that I was someone that they could trust, and that they could push back as well if there was something that wasn't working in our relationship. So from that, 12 trans young men were recruited from the existing supports and services that we provide in the Republic of Ireland to participate in one-to-one, unstructured, in-depth interviews, focus groups, and body mapping workshops. And I will say that all of the participants were engaged in informed consent, and they consented to have their body maps shared for the dissemination of research. They also consented to have their data de-identified. So when I'm talking about participants, I'm using pseudonyms. So then what's body mapping? So really early in the project, I was thinking about how, again, transnormativity is really complex, but also so is trans people's relationships to the idea of our bodies, transition and embodiment, in a way that I felt that textual data alone sometimes doesn't capture those nuances. So I started to think about arts-based research methods, which are really fantastic for generating, interpreting, and disseminating research findings. And they also kind of ask really critical questions about methodological, theoretical, and epistemological contributions to what is knowledge, what is data. And in my kind of trawling through the literature, I came across body mapping, which really is a method that kind of originated in health-based research, working specifically with marginalized communities to think about how the having and being in a body tells you something really meaningful about what it means to be trans in the world. And this for me was an immediate kind of succinct link between the type of trans scholarship that I've always been really passionate about. I've always been really drawn to trans scholarship that thinks about the body not as an object of knowledge among others, but actually is the contingent ground of all of our knowledge, of all of our knowing. And so I was like, absolutely, I want to find a way to bring body mapping into this project. I think it'll be really, really meaningful. So how did I actually do it? So I bought 18 meters of this kind of canvas fabric. You can kind of feel it afterwards. It's got a really lovely texture to it. I primed the canvas with paint and glue, and then I cut it individually for each participant. And then part of this body mapping required a lot of ethical considerations in the grand scheme of the project. And I kind of looked to Hill Malatino to kind of consider the ways in which research ethics are practices of care, or they should be. They should be something that are threaded throughout the research project. They can't be something that sit in the abstract of an application where you've done a tick box. You have to be really considerate around all of the different aspects of the research and how you're engaging with people. So part of that was thinking about really logistical safeguards for trans young men in this project. So I employed specific distress and disclosure protocols for each instance of data collection. So the interviews, the focus groups, and the body mapping workshops, there was a specific distress and disclosure protocol if the specific themes of those data collection moments brought up particular feelings. Part of that as well was I suppose that there was a designated worker other than me on site who was kind of trained in a more supportive role if I needed support as a researcher during the data collection, or if one of the young trans men did as well. And on top of those kind of very logistical kind of I suppose more logistical kind of safeguards and research ethics, I also then started to think about, well, how is the research space going to be a space that is embedded and imbued with ethics as well. So again, there was kind of the logistical of like, where will it be? It had to be geographically and, you know, physically accessible to participants, meeting all of their accessibility desires and needs. All of their travel was paid for. There was like food, hot drinks available all day. There was a quiet space. They had a space where they could go change into clothes that was more comfortable privately if they wanted to. And again, there was that designated worker on site. And really significantly as well, like these research spaces, they allowed for ample setup time. And they also left plenty of time for us to kind of check in and check out with each other at the end of the day. And also, thank you. I was able to stay on site for an hour after kind of data collection finished. So that meant that if any of the participants wanted to come back, they wanted to ask me questions, they wanted to correct something they shared, or they just wanted to get support, I was there and they knew that they could come back. And also as part of that as well, I kind of compiled a list of existing support services and resources in an Irish context, so that in my role in Belong To, I could refer those young men directly into those services if anything cropped up for them during data collection related to their transness or not. But also they had that contact list themselves if they wanted to self-refer. There was also loads of like theoretical considerations that went into the project. I'd love to be able to share an awful lot more about what that was, but I want to just highlight one specific bit, which is like a trans method of humor. So I'm really led by Jules Gill-Peterson in this context, who has this really brilliant piece on her Substack where she's talking about the situational comedy of trans life. And her whole thing is around like, oftentimes the ways in which trans life is positioned is either in like a paranoid reading or it's potentially in the context of humor. And she kind of says it's really meaningful to allow trans people to turn away from that paranoid reading and actually to let us be really funny, because trans people are really funny. And the participants, they really used humor to translate something really meaningful about their lived experience. So from the first interview where I realized that was happening, I was like, okay, I need to, you know, allow for more space for this, to like meet them when they're being humorous, and acknowledge the way that that humor is functioning in the research space. You can see here from James's body map actually that he's doing a limp wrist. So we had this ongoing joke that in every single moment of data collection, someone did a limp wrist to kind of communicate something about like their gender or their femininity or their sexuality. So I just wanted to acknowledge that kind of specific theoretical piece. Again, just some logistical pieces. So each body mapping piece started with guiding principles. So how did we want to be in the space together? That included me as a researcher with them. From my previous facilitation skills, I would have known that actually sharing a collaborative playlist like a week before is a really great kind of method, giving people a chance to kind of curate the space themselves. What do they want to hear when they're doing this workshop? I just want to note as well, and I'm happy to expand on why in questions, but the body mapping workshops itself, they weren't audio or visually recorded. It was just the photos of the body maps. And then there was a guided presentation of a series of 9 exercises, some of which include like when you think about your identity as a trans man in Ireland, thank you, what symbols come to mind, or where does your strength come from? What color is it? Where is it in your body? And then again, as I mentioned, there was ample time for checkout at the end. And then what was the contribution? So I'll be quite brief just around this, but this is a body map from Alex. And up in the top corner, there's a really tiny little plane. And really this is quite significant. There's a number of these motifs across the body maps where participants have put in these very small, almost spectral identifiers related to their experience of kind of being a trans man and embodiment in an Irish context. And I suppose there is no practicing gender affirming surgeons in an Irish context in Ireland. So anyone who wants to have surgery has to travel abroad. And Alex had a very negative experience as a result of traveling abroad that had quite negative health outcomes. And so it's really salient that the plane is this really ongoing kind of motif among other participants about how to kind of communicate that having surgery in Ireland is intrinsically bound up in traveling. And also we have here from Seamus. So the body maps are a really meaningful site of communicating socio-political critique. So Seamus has here HSE depathologization now. So the HSE is the Health Service Executive. That's our government department that delivers health services in Ireland. And we still function on a pathologization model. So there's currently a 10-year waiting list for individuals to have access to a first appointment in the public system in Ireland. And a lot of that is mediated by what I term the transnormative conditions of access. Again, I'm happy to expand on that in any questions, but I just think it's very significant that, you know, I didn't put this out to participants to be like, what do you want to say to your government? They took the opportunity in the body maps to say, we need healthcare and we need it now. And then finally, this theme of reciprocity. So there really was a sense that, and I'm so grateful, obviously, that the participants felt their participation in the project gave something back to them in as much as I benefited and the trans community policy and advocacy benefits from their participation. But the specific space of the kind of body maps was an opportunity. I suppose I'll just highlight kind of two specific things. So number one, it was a site of information sharing. We were talking about what surgeons did you go to? Are you going to get bottom surgery? How are you going to fund it? And also it was a site where people could imagine an emergent gender content. So I'm thinking here with kind of Julian Carter, who talks about Sean Dorsey's work on Lou, where like trans people, we imagine what we're going to look like when we medically transition. And the body maps gave participants a chance to think about, what am I going to look like when I'm old and I have a beard? And it was such an amazing thing to see that emerged in that context. And they really found, which is what I wanted more than anything, that the body maps were fun, that they were fun spaces, that they enjoyed being in together. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. This is my works cited. I'm happy to share it over email if anyone would like it afterwards. But yeah, thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Cavyn. I use he, they, ze pronouns, and I'm going to talk a bit about fashion. So thank you. So how we dress is important. So clothing indicates to others both visible and invisible messages. But clothing is more than just an external indicator. It's also this internal comfort. So Goffman argues that we decipher the social world through the interpretation of symbols and interactions, using this front stage and this backstage, practicing and performing impression management. So this suggests that we change the way we act, think, and present when in the context of others. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to focus on the front stage. So how trans-disabled individuals present themselves to the cis-normative, ableist, wider society. I do argue, however, that this presentation of the self changes when at home, dependent on who lives in that house, and in community settings with other trans-disabled individuals. So trans-disabled individuals face particular problems in relation to beauty and fashion standards, and transgender individuals are often held to ultra-high standards as a form of gender policing. For transgender individuals who transition, whether medically or socially, or for non-binary individuals who aim for androgyny, not a mandatory aspect of non-binary identity, aesthetics around concepts of passing and how society views transgender individuals must be negotiated, and that's often situationally. As bodies that do not fit expected sizing or that disrupt mainstream fashion and clothing choices and ideals, trans-disabled individuals often have little choice with clothing. So for disabled individuals, finding clothing that A, fits, and B, works with their own aesthetic is a challenge, particularly when there are few clothing brands that tailor clothing to suit disability needs. For many disabled individuals, clothing's more than just a fashion statement, so it can be really useful. So for example, for individuals with ASD, clothing without seams or Velcro and fastenings for individuals who have dexterity issues or cerebral palsy. Trans-disabled individuals have this dual burden when it comes to fashion and beauty standards. The distinction between comfort and aesthetic often rivaling the societal expectations of the in fashion of the moment. So using theories of stigma and power, I argue that trans-disabled individuals navigate clothing and make fashion choices strategically based upon situational factors, such as social expectations and comfort or gender affirmation. So gender policing and ultra high beauty and fashion standards. So this could be a whole presentation, so bear with me as I kind of skim through a few things. So the beauty and fashion standards that society holds transgender and gender diverse individuals to are incredibly high and can be argued to be a powerful source of gender policing. So gender policing refers to the regulation and enforcement of gender norms that target an individual who is perceived as transgressing normative rules or the heterosexual matrix. Gender policing is a problem both inside the transgender community and outside the community within wider society. So outside of the transgender community, individuals are expected expect to see some form of tangible change when an individual transitions or comes out as transgender. So this need for a tangible change or a before and after comparison is deeply problematic. Not every transgender or non-binary individual wants to embody certain gendered attributes, and some, such as those with disabilities, are unable to transition medically in certain ways. The expectation that society pushes onto transgender individuals to be accepted as the gender they identify with creates these ultra-high standards of beauty and fashion. So this links to hyper-femininity and hyper-masculinity. So within the transgender community, gender policing also perpetuates this idea that there is a right way to be trans, or a conveyor belt-like system to go through, which tells you how you should progress. Almost like there is only one way to be trans and only one way to transition. So it's really important to note here that there are many ways to be transgender, and there are so many ways to transition, all of which are valid. So Rubin notes a hierarchy based on community standards that stress that hormones make the man. So this idea that to be a man or woman, you must take hormones is a popular view amongst some binary transgender individuals who buy into this idea of the gender binary and expectations that wider society has for them. So the extent of this runs to the point where trans individuals who are not on hormones or cannot take hormones are excluded from some trans spaces. So it's really important to know that this divide between binary trans individuals and non-binary trans individuals is more complex than this statement would suggest. There are many complex decisions to be made when expressing gender and finding safe spaces to exist. It's keeping up. So passing. So the concept of passing is one which is problematic, as it kind of pivots on this binary concept of a pass or fail. So when you start thinking about passing and think about, well, actually the alternative is failing, it's deeply problematic. So the expectations held within wider society around gender expectations do move and change, evolving with time. Ginsberg argues that passing is about identities, their creation or imposition, their adoption or rejection, their accompanying rewards or penalties. So again, these binaries. So this focuses upon narratives and performativity, whereas Goffman argues that passing is about evading stigma, the management of undisclosed, discrediting information about the self. So whether a tool of narrative and performativity or a way to hide stigmatizing aspects of one's life, passing can be either intentional or unintentional, depending upon the situational factors. The politics of passing are complex. Some argue that passing is good through the assimilation into cisgender society, and others argue that passing is bad. It's good to be different, it's good to be seen. So for many transgender individuals, removing the political aspect of passing, it becomes an act of self-actualization and realness. So there are many factors which influence whether a person passes or not, and for some, making the changes necessary are easy and for others impossible. For example, an individual who is able-bodied may be able to wear whatever clothes they like and tolerate additional aspects such as makeup and transitional clothing items such as binders and tugging gaffs. However, for trans-disabled individuals, even something like binding may not be possible due to medical conditions, and this really does impact on whether that person can pass or not. Clothing and passing are tightly entwined, as clothing can be used as a signifier of gender. So, for example, skirts shouldn't be but are seen as purely feminine. The use of clothing in a strategic way can be seen across the transgender community, whether binders and baggy shirts hide the figure of transmasculine AFAB non-binary folks, or corsets and cinching sculpt the figures of transfeminine AMAB non-binary folks. The use of clothing as a signifier is a clever device, as clothing can be used to indicate different aspects of a person's social identity, including class, religion, occupation, and of course, gender. So moving to the comfort versus aesthetic. So whilst aesthetic and design are both important attributes when transgender individuals are thinking about clothing and fashion, the overall comfort and the way a clothing item fits is also important. For example, a trans woman may not feel comfortable wearing any form of clothing which is from the men's section. However, the way that women's clothing is contoured and shaped may exclude trans women from being able to access a certain aesthetic. Comfort goes beyond the gender binaries and into the realms of disability, where textures become a comfort or true pain for neurodiverse individuals, and clasps become problematic for those with dexterity issues. Clothing for disabled individuals is interesting, as this is just entering the mainstream, already at the high end of mainstream fashion industry. For example, in the UK, Tommy Hilfiger offers a range of adaptive clothing which is suitable for specific needs. This is both positive and problematic, as it seems only the most expensive brands are branching into adaptive clothing, which adds to the concept of disability tax. So this idea that anything aimed at disabled individuals has a higher price. When there is a need for both disability-friendly clothing and transgender-friendly clothing, the intersection of suitable clothing shrinks. So there are also clothing brands who cater for neurodiverse and autistic individuals, making seamless clothing or using specific fabrics and printing labels rather than having tags. There are many considerations for autistic and neurodiverse individuals. For example, fabrics and textures, labels, tags and seams, tightness of clothing, body and skin sensations, and also, lastly, aesthetic. So interestingly, the majority of clothing that's adapted to disability-based needs are created for children, giving adults little choice in what they wear if they wish to access adaptive clothing. So this impacts on the choices that they can make in terms of fashion, and is where strategic navigation occurs, as there is a choice to be made between comfort and aesthetic, meeting social expectations or feeding disability needs. So research suggests that compression and heavy weighted blankets can soothe and aid sensory processing in individuals with autism. In the USA, there are compression vests marketed for children with autism, which are very suspiciously similar to binders worn by AFAB individuals. This shows that whilst there are so many areas where it's a choice between comfort and aesthetic, there are a few options which promote both gender affirmation and sensory comfort. It's also important to note that compression shirts, binders, and weighted blankets are not found to be comforting to all individuals with autism. Another factor when considering autism and clothing is the repetition of clothing. Safe and comfortable outfits may be worn repeatedly with quick washes in between. For AFAB individuals who wear binders and have autism, binding can be comfortable, compressive feeling, as well as maintaining some gender affirmation and euphoria. The intersection of adaptive clothing and transitionary devices here really reinforces the argument that trans-disabled lives are complex strategic matrices which are navigated through the ideologies of power and stigma. In some cases, stigma may be embraced as a way to claim identity, whether transgender or disability, and affirm gender. However, stigma can also be evaded through the use of strategic positionality of identities. For example, an individual may use autism as an excuse to leave a room on the grounds of sensory overload, when really they just don't feel safe being overtly transgender. So, moving on to disruption and conformity. So some transgender people attempt to fit cultural gender standards, and some work actively to dismantle cultural gender standards. So clothing allows transgender individuals the option to conform or disrupt these expectations and standards. So whether this is through obscure clothing, jarring aesthetics, or simply fitting in with the expectations of gender within wider society, the use of clothing to conform or disrupt societal and cultural expectations of gender can be seen as a way to control the perception of the individual. Perceptions are very important when an individual wishes to pass, as discussed earlier. So clothing can also be used as a way to be visible or invisible. For example, trans men have been known to wear a comfort hoodie, also known as a dysphoria hoodie. I have one myself. It's just a big baggy hoodie, which is used to hide the shape and to lessen dysphoria or to decrease the chances of being misgendered, as the body type and shape has been obscured. So moving on to concluding thoughts. So within this presentation, I've explored how trans-disabled individuals strategically navigate clothing and fashion choices, choosing when and how to pass and when to be visible or invisible. It's clear that clothing can be a marker of identity, a cloak of mystery, and a way to meet disability needs. So when choosing clothing, trans-disabled individuals are walking the tightrope of power and stigma, vying for an existence that is often deemed wrong. Thank you.